Last time we went over three of the phyla within the protostomes. Remember, the protostomes are this group of phyla here. They and the deuterostomes over here are all descended from a bilaterally symmetrical ancestor. But the protostomes and the deuterostomes have a different step very early in development. In the protostomes, the blastopore becomes the mouth. In the deuterostomes, it becomes the anus. That trait is not of particular ecological importance, but it indicates that these two groups of species parted ways evolutionarily a very long time ago. Today, what I'm going to be going over is the last of the phyla within the protostomes and the first within the deuterostomes. The phylum Arthropoda is the last of the protostome phyla that we have to deal with, and it is tremendously diverse. That is, in fact, the most famous thing about this phylum. It contains a huge variety of forms that are found on the land, in the ocean, and in the air. They are parts of our everyday world, some of which you probably hate, some of which you've never seen before, and some of which you probably didn't even realize were arthropods. The arthropods consist of a handful of different groups. There are the chelicerates, the myriapods, the crustaceans, and the hexapods, which are mostly known as the insects. In terms of diversity, there is nothing even remotely close to the phylum Arthropoda. This is a diagram of each one of these icons shows basically the relative species diversity of each of these groups of organisms. This, for example, is the entire plant kingdom. There are roughly as many non-insect arthropods species as there are plant species. And when you add in the insects, insects basically outnumber all of the other known species of multicellular organisms in the world put together. It's possible that there are enough microbes in the world yet to be discovered that insects won't be more than half of the world's diversity, but it's pretty unlikely. So by far, most of the arthropods are insects. As far as species richness goes, insects are far and above the most successful group of organisms on Earth. In the arthropods, in the insects, there are 1.1 million described species. There's a huge number that have not yet been described. And so if there's one thing we can be sure of, it's that in fact, the animals that we're most familiar with, things like, say, mammals, you can barely make out the mammal here, mammals are actually a much smaller percentage of the total than this diagram would suggest. So what do all of this vast number of species have in common? Well, they're the second group of organisms that we've looked at so far that are truly segmented, or metameric. That is, the body consists of repeated structures, many of them usually in a row. For some of the arthropods, you have the same basic system as you see in the annelids, or the segmented worms. Each consecutive segment looks the same as the one before. This is what's called homonymous segmentation. But for the first time in the arthropods, we also see what's called heteronymous segmentation. Insects are segmented, and you can see it most clearly on the abdomen, but the thorax and head are also made up of multiple segments. It's just that those segments have come to look radically different from one another, and so they're not as recognizable as the segments on, say, this millipede, which is also an arthropod. In the insects in particular, but also in some of the other arthropods, not only are the segments different from one another, but multiple segments have become fused together into larger body regions. These regions are called tagmata. One of these regions is called a tagma. Together, multiple ones are called tagmata. In the insects, the tagmata, for example, are the head, shown in purple here, the thorax, shown in blue, and the abdomen, shown in green. From our point of view, the arthropod skeleton is inside out. We have what's called an endoskeleton. Our bones are essentially at the center of, say, our limbs, or they're well within places like our trunk or torso. And all of the other stuff that we are made of is wrapped around that skeleton. So the muscles, the nerves, the vessels, the organs, and so forth are on the outside of that skeleton, kind of hanging off of it. In the arthropods, it's the opposite. The muscles, the nerves, the organs are all on the inside, in the core of the organism, and the skeleton is wrapped around the outside. So, for example, while your muscles connect to your bones, and as they pull bones toward one another or away, that's what moves your body. It's exactly inside out for an arthropod. The muscles are attached to the inside of these different plates within the skeleton. The plates are articulated to one another, and as these muscles contract, that's what moves the legs of the arthropod. It's muscles within the skeleton instead of wrapped around the outside. This may seem strange. It seems very counterintuitive to us because we're used to our own skeletons. But in fact, this is one of the innovations that's made the arthropods so incredibly successful. The exoskeleton provides protection both against things like predators or parasites, but also more importantly against the environment. It's built out of layers, and when there are very few layers, it remains flexible. When there are many built up, it becomes rigid, and so it provides not only protection but structural support, supporting the weight of the body and providing something for muscles to pull against. The exoskeleton can be built in a fantastic variety of shapes, almost any shape that you can imagine. And this allows the parts of an arthropod to play wildly different roles. If you look at, for example, the legs of different insects adapted to doing different things, you'll see all sorts of shapes, each adapted to their specific ecological job. Some of the arthropods, particularly the terrestrial arthropods, actually have a waxy coating over the outside so that the cuticle is almost impermeable in terms of water loss. Others, like marine crabs, have calcium salts deposited in that exoskeleton, so it's nearly as hard as rock. In other words, this exoskeleton is extremely versatile, it's incredibly useful, and it probably is one of the key innovations that allowed these organisms to take over the world. In terms of its manufacture, it, like the cell walls of fungi, is made of the polysaccharide named chitin. But there's also a lot of protein in there. In particular, at the joints where the structure needs to bend, it contains a lot of protein that makes the joints flexible. Many arthropods use gills, at least the ones that live in the water. In other words, they have these frilly or plate-like structures that have lots and lots of surface area for gas exchange exposed to the water. However, gills don't work out of water, and the conquest of land by the arthropods involved a different way of breathing. In most of the terrestrial arthropods, what you have is what's called a tracheal system. It's a series of very, very fine tubes that run all through the body of the organism. And they actually open to the outside air, as you can see on this diagram here. So you have the open air that lets onto a system of chambers and tubes. There may be air sacs, there may be these very fine tubes. They get gradually smaller and smaller until the very, very fine tubes that are full of air are within a fraction of a millimeter of every cell in the animal's body. This means that there can be gas exchange by diffusion with the gas in the tracheal system. And then the gas that's into the tracheal system can diffuse back and forth with the outside air, the air outside of the organism, or in many cases it's actually ventilated actively. As the organism compresses and expands its abdomen, that will push stale air out of the tracheal system and draw fresh air in. This is what the tracheae look like, the tracheal tubes look like on a scanning electron micrograph, a microscope slide, and this is what the opening of the outside looks like on a scanning electron micrograph. This very small hole to a tracheal tube is called a spiracle. And you should recognize, again, a common theme here. You have this very high surface area system inside an organism that provides the area necessary for gas exchange, but the openings to the outside are very, very small to reduce water loss. There is one real problem with this exoskeleton, though, is that an organism cannot become bigger while it is inside a rigid exoskeleton. And the only way that you can have an exoskeleton that isn't rigid is if it provides much less protection, much less support, much less of a skeleton. There are some soft-bodied insects that mostly they grow by just expanding, by stretching, including a lot of caterpillars. But almost all arthropods are basically constrained from growing by the fact that they have to get rid of the old exoskeleton and build a new one. What they do actually is they grow a larger exoskeleton inside the smaller old one, but it remains soft. Then they split the old exoskeleton along one seam and extract themselves from it, a very slow and difficult process in many cases, until finally the old exoskeleton is left behind. They expand their body into the new soft exoskeleton and allow it to harden. This is very expensive. It takes a lot of energy in many cases to get out of that old exoskeleton. You're throwing away a lot of material that you put into that old exoskeleton. In addition, an arthropod is extremely vulnerable when it's going through the molting process. So it's perhaps no surprise that this whole elaborate system only evolved once, as far as we know. It leads to this very, very versatile, very successful skeleton, but it has these very high costs to it as well. Another cost to having this exoskeleton is that there's a strict limit to how large you can get. Remember that a strength to weight ratio goes down dramatically as an animal gets larger. And you can see that in the skeleton of an elephant over here, and this is a skeleton of a rat over here. The rat has proportionally much, much thinner bones, and it can still hold its body by having those bones at an angle. An elephant has to have its weight directly over its legs, and it has to have very thick bones, because otherwise these bones wouldn't be able to support its weight. An insect the insect exoskeleton would start to collapse under the animal's weight at sizes of maybe a couple of pounds, probably. It's not entirely clear. But it does place a very clear limit on how large an arthropod can get. They can get bigger in the ocean because the ocean water is supporting a lot of their weight, but you're never going to see an insect as large as your average sized mammal. In addition, there's another factor that really limits the size of terrestrial arthropods that use the tracheal system. A tracheal system, because ultimately the gas exchange involves diffusion, the distance that you can have between the outside of the organism and the living cells on the inside is limited. There were some very large insects in, say, the Carboniferous area when you had dragonflies that could pick up a chihuahua. But remember that those animals had very long, thin bodies, so none of their tissues were more than a few centimeters from the outside. It turns out that more than anything is the limiting factor on how large at least insects can get, is the limitations on how far the tracheal system can effectively reach within their bodies.